Welcome to IVF This, Episode 14, the IVF Fog. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hi, friends. How is everyone doing today? I'm really excited because I am about to leave town to go visit my parents. They've both been vaccinated, in case you're wondering, so I cannot wait to see them. We live about 6-ish hours away from them, so it's a bit of a drive. Anywhere in Texas is a bit of a drive, but they still live in my hometown of Lubbock, and I haven't been back to Lubbock in probably 3 years. I've seen my parents in that time, but it's usually that they come to us because my brother and his family and my family live about an hour from each other, so logistically it just makes more sense. So I'm really excited to see my parents and take my boys on a road trip and all of that. Also, I want to remind you that if you haven't taken my free course, 3 Simple Steps to Managing Your IVF Anxiety, do it now. It's like 12 minutes long or thereabouts, and it provides a basic framework for managing anxiety, and I give it to all of my clients. You can find it at my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, and about halfway down, and you'll see the class and how to access it. There are also links on both my Instagram and Facebook pages, which are both at IVF This Coaching. So if you haven't done it now, do it now. Or wait, listen to this episode first and then do it. All right, so today we're going to talk about a little phenomenon called IVF Fog. It's not something that's really talked about in the IVF and infertility world, but it's something that I noticed during my own IVF experiences, so I thought I would share it with all of you. There are other terms for it like griever's fog or trauma fog, but since we're all IVFers here, we're going to call it the IVF fog. I want to help you understand why it happens, what are the components of it, and a few ideas about what to do with it. So the IVF fog is common but rarely discussed condition that occurs after a significant loss or traumatic experience. Also, when you are under an extreme amount of stress, which if you're going through IVF, one or all of those would describe your experience. Both or all of them can occur within the context of infertility and IVF. You know, the name of my game is to create awareness around these things, because if you're experiencing these symptoms, you might be inclined to call yourself crazy. But I assure you, my dear, my friend, you are not crazy. We are also inclined to believe that if we're going through something like this is how we will always function. But that's not true either. You know how I know? Because we all get better. Okay, so what is this IVF fog that I'm talking about? See if you can recognize yourself in any of these scenarios. Maybe you're gearing up for your first cycle and you feel completely overwhelmed by the logistics, the doctor's appointments, the blood draws, the ultrasounds, medication delivery, when to take them, how to inject them, and how to mix them, juggling your work, juggling your family. You would normally consider yourself a pretty organized person, but lately, anything but IVF seems to fall by the wayside. Maybe some work deadlines have come and gone, or your partner asked you to drop something off at the post office for several days in a row and you just can't seem to remember it. The little details you normally have well in hand are just kind of slipping through the cracks. Maybe you've had a failed transfer or found out that none of your embryos have made it. And in your grief, you've shut down and disassociated from the people that you love. You tell people you'll call them back and you don't. Maybe you keep losing or misplacing your keys. You're growing more and more frustrated with what you call your airheadedness. Maybe you experienced a loss and you can't focus on anything. I had a client that had suffered a miscarriage after her first transfer. She was a nurse and she had such difficulty focusing that she decided to take a leave of absence because she didn't want to put her patients in danger due to her inability to focus. Now, we worked through it because she didn't recognize what was happening to her was the IVF fog. Once we were able to process that and she understood what was happening, she went back to work very quickly. For another client of mine, she talked about working at her desk and zoning out on the computer or in meetings for however many minutes without actually doing any work. Then her phone would ring or someone would say her name and it snapped her back to the present moment. For some of us, it means being in a conversation and all of a sudden not knowing what is being said, not knowing where the conversation was headed, forgetting what your point was, and feeling completely spaced out. I will freely admit this is something that is very typical for me when I am super stressed out. After our failed transfer, I did this when I would read or when I was watching TV. When I was reading, I couldn't retain the words. I recognized the words and I was sort of going through the motions of reading, but that was it. I couldn't recall anything I had just read. And when I was watching TV, same thing. If it was something I hadn't seen before, I would get lost very quickly and I'd have to rewind. Then I would get so frustrated. I would end up turning something on that I had seen before so I could zone in and out. It was like this haziness, not of anything particular, just hazy. It wasn't like I was in denial about what had happened. I could remember it clearly, but it was like I was very detached from it. So it's really important to know that this is your brain doing exactly what brains are supposed to. In times of great stress, grief, or trauma, our brains try to protect us, so we don't feel the full impact of it immediately. I always visualize my brain kind of throwing a blanket over itself. You can kind of see through it like a crocheted blanket, but it's really hard to see clearly. So through this protective instinct in our brain, it can feel like we are kind of dampened down or numb, or again, everything is hazy, as if you're in a fog. Again, this is a protective process. It is an adaptation that we have through our evolution to help us survive when we are presented with trauma or extreme stress. A couple of things that I've noticed from myself as well as some of my clients, it can almost feel like a dreamlike state, but pretty inconsistent. Like one day you feel like the fog is lifting, and then the next day, bam, it's back. One of the things that is so frustrating about the IVF fog is our inability to predict it, or if and when it's going to end. That can be very frustrating and disheartening, and that's when we sometimes start to believe that, well, this is just where we are now. In the fog, it can be very difficult to make decisions. It may be more difficult to access willpower. Maybe you're snacking more or drinking more or something like that. We can feel physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. I think this is so crucial to understand because when we're talking about stress and trauma related to infertility and IVF, we don't typically think of it as actual trauma. I have 2 episodes earlier in the podcast dedicated to this topic. So if you haven't listened to those, check that out. But essentially, people think of trauma as something that physically happens to you or someone you love. What we don't think about is emotional trauma is still trauma. That is what our brains are trying to recover from. The trauma and loss that we have experienced throughout our journey. It does not mean that because you're experiencing the IVF fog, that something is wrong with you. It is just a byproduct of your brain's natural reaction to trauma. So naturally, it feels like everything is out of whack. There are several studies that show that the stress level of those experiencing infertility or going through IVF is similar to the stress levels of those experiencing cancer or other chronic diseases. When the brain experiences significant stress, or when you're grieving, your brain experiences increased activity in the regions responsible for processing physical pain, emotional regulation, memory, multitasking, organization, and learning. During this time, we have this flood of neurochemicals and hormones. And when those are out of whack, our sleep can be disturbed and we can experience fatigue, increased stress and anxiety, all of the favorite hits, right? Then when all of these things combine to make the perfect shitstorm that's happening, our brains take a major hit. The effects of this can also be seen in increased cortisol levels, which cortisol is basically a hormone that is released when we're stressed, right? It's a big part of this whole process because when we have excess cortisol, the prefrontal cortex part of our brain, the part of our brain that regulates emotions and memories, amongst other things, is being taxed further. With too much cortisol in our system, we are less able to process things. So it's no wonder that we're on the struggle bus, stopping at every struggle stop along the struggle route. It's not surprising that we are overwhelmed, that we can't retain information, or that we zone out. This is the IVF fog. So now that you know a little bit more about what it is, hopefully you can understand that you're not stupid or crazy or whatever bullshit you've been telling yourself. Now, I bet you want to know what to do with it, right? Well, if you've listened to me for any period of time, I think you will know that the first step is always compassion. Compassion, 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 compassion. I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. When you show yourself compassion, you begin to see that this isn't the result of something you're doing wrong. You can also begin to acknowledge that this is not going to last forever. This absolutely does not need to be another reason that you beat yourself up, or that it's another thing that you need to worry about. Your brain is just trying to protect you, and there is nothing more normal than that. The second step, which is something that I champion for everything, is to try and find some humor in it. Now, I know that we're really good at telling ourselves very unhelpful things, but when we make a mistake, when we do that, we actually create a breeding ground to continue to make other mistakes or to kick the crap out of ourselves. No one has ever hated themselves into perfection. It doesn't exist. So instead of beating yourself up for missing something or forgetting something, have a little chuckle about it. Maybe you unloaded the groceries from the car and accidentally put the car keys in the fridge, which I've done. Or as you got out of the car, you accidentally left them in the car and locked it. Also from personal experience. I'm not really to be trusted with keys when I'm under a lot of stress or grieving. I think I've just learned that about myself today. The point is that there is humor to be found during this time. And humor feels a hell of a lot better than letting it be frustrating or judging yourself or worrying about it or feeling embarrassed. Try to find the humor in these little moments as best you can. And then, of course, and this is IVF fog or no fog, take care of yourself. Find those outlets that allow you to process what's going on for you. Journaling can be magical. Art or any sort of creative outlet, meditation, yoga, exercise, anything that contributes to the mind-body connection can be amazing. Making time for not just the work of grief and stress, but those activities that when you're doing them, time just seems to pass. Those activities that you kind of forget about what's going on around you. As much as you can, take time for self-care. Get sleep when you can, get support where you can. Support groups can be wonderful, counseling, life coaching. Figure out what support you need and take that time for you. You're worth it, and there's nothing wrong with you if you're experiencing the IVF fog. Okay, my friends, that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you next week. Remember, I adore you, and you've got this. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard and want to learn more, head over to ivfthiscoaching.com. That's www.ivfthiscoaching.com.